very much for joining us, and to everyone for joining us for the second webinar in the wellness series. I want to start off today by, first of all, thanking everyone who's going to be speaking today, specifically Dr. Assar and Lombardi, as well as an esteemed panel, Dr. DuPont, Dr. Trong, Dr. Atkinson, and Dr. Abudaya. I also want to thank the SCAI staff for supporting us and bringing this all together. As you may know, getting interventional cardiologists together is somewhat like herding cats, and sometimes it can be challenging. So thank you to the SCAI staff and for everyone for making this a priority and for tuning in tonight. This is the second of our series on the wellness or well-being, where we really try to address the emotional aspect of the EQ aspect, if you will, of this profession, and hopefully provide some tools by which we can better cope with the immense mental challenges that each of us face every single day in this profession. Complications are inevitable, and they will happen to every single one of us, and they can be devastating to our careers and to our psyche. And we as the SCAI Wellness Task Force really have opted to address these with this webinar. I think Andreas Grunzig himself said, if you're going to do this, you should expect complications. And these complications, again, can affect every single one of us in various different ways, depending upon our background. They can be minor, they can be exceptionally morbid, sometimes leading to permanent disability and or death. Each of these have our own impact. Each of these events impacts us in an emotional, physical, spiritual, and basically a diverse way that every single one of us as operators and our teams get impacted. And so with this, I want to go back in time to when each of us were residents, and probably to this day, if you're in morbidity and mortality conferences, and kind of bring us back to that and a story that came up as I was preparing this talk, which is as we would prepare as residents for these talks, M&Ms, we would nervously put our cases together and hope to God that we didn't get called on too much or didn't get crucified too much by our attendings. But we probably all feared what this would bring up. What would our reputations be with the attendings? What would our reputations with the medical students, or the fellows? Or worse, our own colleagues be after admitting and going through this mistake. One time in M&M, after I was called on to comment on one of my colleagues' actions, they panned to a senior attending. In this case happened to be someone who was performing a diagnostic paracentesis in a patient with advanced ovarian cancer, and at that time happened to hit bowel with the needle. And they panned over after they asked for my response, which I don't even remember what it was, but they went to this world famous hepatologist and said, Tony, what do you think about this? Expecting him to jump on board and start crucifying this attending or this poor resident about what had happened. And to his honor and to his style, and more importantly, his immense ability to make everyone laugh, but also show such grace, he said, well, the first time this happened to me, of which everyone started laughing, implying that in fact it happened. He thought to himself, this is exactly what you have in the needle. And something about a South African accent about saying that made it sound so much better that this complication had occurred to him not just once, but several times. And I think at the end of the day, what that tells me is that each of us have a choice. We can have a choice when complications happen to show some grace to ourselves and to our colleagues, because at the end of the day, we as humans, not just as physicians, have a tendency to be hypercritical. Shakespeare once said, the evil that men do lives on after them, while the good that they do often is interred within their bones. So it is not just a hypercritical interventional cardiologist kind of type A personality that is hypercritical, but we as humans. And I think that hepatologist's statement and the way he handled that sort of morbid, kind of nerve-wracking environment was to bring some humor to it, but also show some grace. And I think each of this, as we approach this emotional burden of complications, can actually do that. And so with that, let us begin and let's talk about the stigmas attached to the emotional burdens of complications. What I would like to first do would be to break down what these emotional burdens might be but also what stigmas may be, and hopefully kind of intricately link them together with an idea of basically addressing this from top to bottom. And so, first of all, my disclosure is I'm fully committed, like Bill Lombardi is, who has joined us today, and I think all of us are, to changing our culture of medicine. I think all of us are hypercritical. All of us are hard on ourselves. And I think all of us, of course, would love to live in a world without complications. And I always tell people, I'm not going to do this because once that happened to me, and good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. But I think at the end of the day, we will continue to have complications. The best of the best will have complications. It doesn't matter. It will happen. Not when, not if, it will be when. And I've had my share of complications. I'm mid-career now. I've been doing this for around 15 years. And trust me, I've seen plenty of patients come into the lab, unfortunately walkie-talkie, and not leave the lab. And that is devastating. And I can tell you every single one of them on one hand. And I think the idea is that I'm not perfect at this either, but my disclosure is that it is an ever evolving process on how to deal with complications. And I think all of us has to understand what is the evolving process for each of us individually. Well, here's a perspective. I found this on the internet, which I thought was interesting, as an Athenian physician from 2 AD, that the eternal duties of a physician are first to heal his mind and to give him, and that first and foremost, give assistance to himself before giving it to anyone else. Sort of reminds me of when you're on a plane and say if the air oxygen drops, then you should take care of yourself first and then somebody else. But I think this underscores the importance of taking care of ourselves first, or else we can't take care of other people. When it comes to complications, medical errors are currently recognized as maybe the third leading cause of death. Almost 440,000 annual fatalities secondary to medical errors, given around 660 or 600,000 physicians. That's one death due to a medical error for each doctor nearly every year. So each of us, directly or indirectly, will be involved in this no matter what we do. And so with that, we must understand how to handle that. As a background, for those of you who are interested in this topic, we talk about little t trauma and big T trauma when it comes to complications or to events in life. I would say that complications are big T trauma or big events that happen. These are events that can limit a career, end a career. And I think it's really important to underscore that these are just as important as some of the other trauma, big T trauma that occurs, and to take it just as seriously. So let's start off by looking at what stigmas are. Well, what are they? They're a mark of disgrace, according to Webster Dictionary, associated with a particular circumstance. And I think it's really important to understand that when you look at shame or disgrace or dishonor or stain, that this is an understanding of not only how stigmas are from within, but also externally. And often we're the one feeling pointed at, just like that M&M. And I think it's understand that the power of stigmas is beyond what I can mark with words, and feeling that from a day-to-day down the road. This is an understanding of where stigmas are, and I think most of us really understand about where we are from a social or public stigma. We think about stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, but really we can have a self-stigma too. Internalized feelings of shame, low self-esteem, low self-efficacy. This is what happens with complications. All of us know that feeling, that warm wash of shame as it comes over you, as Brene Brown would say. Because when it happens, you feel like you're the only one who's ever experienced it, and it can be devastating. And then, of course, there's structural stigmas that happen. Things that can happen if you have complications. You may feel a structural stigma to present in front of your colleagues, but it also may be an opportunity for growth. Just for a side here, I just included some of the mental health stigma. I don't think it's much different than complication stigma. You can get labeling, oh, they're a bad operator. You can be put aside, oh, I don't want to be around them. You could be devalued, discriminated against. I mean, I would say that probably there are physicians in each of our labs that perhaps staff don't really want to do procedures with. Now, that may be because they had complications. It may be that they're just a jerk, or it may be that they differ in some sort of opinion, or there's been some labeling. And remember, in a microcosm of cath lab, this can be a huge thing depending upon how big your lab is and how many people are there. Even in a big lab such as my own, it definitely does occur. And there are stigmas that do happen. So I think it's really important to understand there are intrapersonal and interpersonal as well as structural stigmas that can occur. So that's stigmas. Let's look at the emotional burdens of complications and let's see how that ties in. Well, I couldn't help but put in at least a movie reference here or there. And those burdens of complications include fear. Oh my God, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the patient right now, but what's going to happen to me? Am I going to lose my job? Guilt. I was entrusted with this patient's care and this happened to them. Anger. Why did I miss that? How did I miss that? Or worse, maybe you blame it on someone for distracting you. Embarrassment, of course, and we don't want to look bad in front of our partners or in front of our families. Humiliation. But what about professional reputation concerns? What about reduced job satisfaction? If you don't feel like you're very good at what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you don't really want to go to work. You can lose confidence and also worry that you will continue to make errors. Many of us are perfectionists, right? And Brene Brown, I referenced her before. If you haven't read any of her stuff, I highly recommend it. When perfectionism is driving, shame is usually riding shotgun and fear is that annoying backseat driver. It usually all comes together. So I think it's really important from a side of as an operator, but also as a human, to understand that these complications will happen and these emotions will come out. What are the prevalence? Well, how about you? It's not just a movie, but I'm going to ask you about the prevalence. What do each of you, have you felt this? I would say this number that I found in the data, about 30% of medical students, physicians, nurses reporting a personal problems related to an adverse event over the last 12 months. Well, I'll raise my hand 5 times over. I think over the last 12 months, I've had more than a few complications, and I've seen those patients back in clinic. In fact, just a few hours ago, I saw one. I thought to myself, can't believe I did that. I can't believe that happened. But yes, those issues keep coming back. And I would venture to say it's higher than 30%. But ask yourself, what about you? Are you having any of these reoccurring thoughts, memories, whatever it may be? And really what we're talking about here is second victim syndrome. For those of you who are not familiar with this, the first victim is obviously the patient who has a occurrence of a complication. The second victim is actually any healthcare provider, not just the operator, any healthcare provider involved in an unanticipated adverse patient occurrence who experiences psychological or emotional trauma related to that event. So it may not just be you as the primary operator, maybe your staff. It may be a nurse on the floor that, really got attached to this patient and they have a bad outcome. This can happen across the spectrum of those who are on the healthcare provider team. And it wasn't until 2000, and I would say a little bit embarrassing that it took this long, until 2000, that Wu actually made this statement, medical error, the second victim. And there's been a fair amount of data looking at this, looking at surgeons more than anything else, and biomedical surgeons, interventional cardiologists, addressing the second victim syndrome. Really, what is that phenomenon? What do we carry? And this article about the things we carry, the scope and impact. All of us know these complications. I'd venture to say most of us can remember all the deaths we've had in a cath lab. Probably can remember every single instance of it. And really, when the doctor makes mistakes, needs help too. We are human. And the second victim syndrome really embodies what that encounters. Well, Albert Wu wrote this, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but I thought it made a lot of sense when I first read it. It said, we virtually all know the sickening realization of making a bad mistake. And I underscored what it feels like. You feel singled out, exposed. You agonize what to do. And later the event replays over and over in your mind. You start questioning your competence. Now it goes on to say, should you confess about it? And all of us have an ethical obligation to disclose these errors. And I think, going on about whether or not you should talk to her or not, but a lot of us can become overly attentive to the patient and the family, probably medically, legally being fearful. But I think when I read this, Albert Wu's initial statement in BMJ in 2000, I think, we can all relate to this. Well, what does it do to you? Well, in one early study looking at about 32 patients who had second victim syndrome, the extreme fatigue was prevalent about 52% of the time, sleep disturbances about 45% of the time, rapid heart rate, increased blood pressure, muscle tension, rapid breathing. These all sound like PTSD. And this is another phrase or another form of PTSD. What about psychological symptoms? Well, you can read right through there: frustration, decreased job satisfaction, and go right down the list. This is in 32 patients in an article looking at what are the different stages, trying to quantify what happens when we become a second victim. What exactly does occur? Well, if you say, well, that's 32 patients, Drew, that's really not a lot. Well, let's look at some data looking at a systematic review across several studies. Same thing's prevalent. Troubling memories, almost 81% of the time. I still have them. Still have them. Anxiety, concern. What about anger towards oneself, being frustrated with it? These are all important issues that happen to every single one of us when we have complications. And it's really important to understand that as we go forward and address that. Because if we don't name it, we can't address it. Well, what about the stages then? That first article that's really looked at 32 patients or subjects, should I say, 32 of us that have had complications. What do they go through? Well, the first stage was chaos and kind of accident response. Let's take care of the patient right now. And I think all of us are pretty good at that. You know, I had a pericardial, I had an epicardial perforation. Okay, let's go into status mode, jump right in. Let's do a pericardiocentesis. Let's auto transfuse. Let's get the team going. Let's get echo. All right, we do that kind of intuitively. All right, error recognizing, get help, and then stage 2, intrusive reflections. Well, how did that happen? Did I not pay attention? Did I oversize the balloon? Did I miss some calcium? And then stage 3, looking at kind of like, okay, how does restoring personal integrity, like what will others think? If I've had to use yet a papyrus stent, what does that matter? Will I ever be trusted again? Will this patient come back and trust me again? That's really important to understand. How much trouble am I getting in? Is it going to be an issue? And then we go into stage 4, which is during the Inquisition. I think this is kind of talking about the M&M, interacting with different levels of, going debriefing, reiterating the case scenario, going through this, and, kind of what that impact is are you going to be brought up in front of the medical board? How is this going to pull out depending upon what that type of event was? And then, of course, stage 5 would be obtaining emotional first aid. And I think we really want to focus in on this tonight. How do you seek professional and personal support for each of these? How do you actually allow someone to say, it's okay, you made a mistake, and that's part of life? That's how do you get back on that horse and go out there and treat the next patient? That's a little bit harder to do. It's easy to say, it's a little bit harder to do. And then you go through, you think, what did I respond to this matter? What's wrong with me? Do I need help? And then I think the last thing I really want to focus on are moving on, because I think all of us have gone through these various stages, and there's really a split here, right? You can either drop out, say, I'm done, I can't deal with this anymore. You can survive, or you can thrive. And we really don't have data on where people are going to go in this mess. We don't know who's going to drop out. We don't know who's going to survive. We don't know who's going to thrive. And so how do we get everyone to thrive? And I think that's more kind of what we're talking about today. It's understanding the emotional burden of what complications do to us, understanding the stigmas that happen to each and every single one of us. But more importantly, how do we get to the aspect that every single one of us, when we have our complications, will eventually get to the last stage and we will thrive, not drop out, and not just limp along as surviving. So I say, what can we do? And I think it's really important. Walt Whitman always said, be curious, not judgmental. So I think it's really important as we approach anything in life, but especially with complications, not just saying, well, how did this happen? Let's stop and say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Yes, the complication, how are you doing? You're not being judgmental. So resist the primal urge to criticize. And we'll talk a little bit more about this with the next speaker, but I think it's really important to understand that we have to resist that primal urge to go on and criticize. It is innate in every single one of us, and I think we have to show some grace. really help and not hurt. Any of us, and I think all of us have had complications, know how bad it feels to be in that situation. The last thing you want is somebody to add some insult to injury. And then I think it's really important for each of us to do that deep dive, that self-work, so-called shadow work, and understand what works best for you. Some people love to talk out loud in groups. Some people love to be left alone for a little bit and work one-on-one with people. Ask what works best for your teammate. So if your partner has a complication, ask them how they're doing. You'll deal with the complication, and we talk about the technical aspects, but ask how they're doing. What works best for them? Approach with curiosity. Is it helpful for you to say, you know, something, we probably need to talk about this one-on-one, or should we talk about this as a team? What's going to work best for you? And then expand our perspective of mental health disorders. We don't know what people are coming into each event with. We don't know, have they had this before? Is this remembering or reminding them of something else? We don't know what their background is. So be curious, not judgmental. I think we also need to adapt evidence-based practices for decreasing stigma. I think in discrimination in the workplace, I think we need to do this not only for mental health, but across the board. I think we need to really decrease stigmatization of anything more than anything else. Understanding that events will happen and we can all try to get better. And it's all about getting better each day. We can really change our use of stigmatizing language. We can create a professional culture of caring. That's not necessarily true. You can't go back and change how perhaps your boss is, but you can create a culture around it, and culture trumps everything. Now, I like to say that we should normalize therapy, perhaps even have it be part of the culture post complications. I would argue that maybe that's the next step. We all joke about, the different generational changes. My kids in their generation and Gen Z, if you don't have a therapist, there's something wrong with you. And I think it's really important to understand that perhaps as we evolve as a profession, we will see more and more involvement of their professional counseling, professional therapy. And I think it's important because all of us do carry these burdens, and I would love to see more of that as we go forward. So I just want to stop and just bring up 3 scenarios and just see how that has influenced you. Think about each of these, and I'm going to go through each and every one. And what's the first thing that jumps to your mind? So 35-year-old junior attending, female attending, has a refractory no reflow during PCI, VT storm, and the patient arrest. First thought, she doesn't know what she's doing. She should have seen that coming. You have a potential here for sexism, a potential here for ageism. Where did your mind go? Where did your thought process go? Ask yourself honestly, where did you go with this process when you heard that scenario? Because you may help underscore or help reveal some underlying biases you might have. Or what if a 57-year-old senior male attending has a patient during a CTO revascularization have an air embolism and arrest? Well, if you don't like this individual, maybe you're thinking he was sloppy, he was moving too fast, he's impatient. Well, approach with curiosity, not with judgment. Or how about an older attending who misses a wire dissection, has stent thrombosis, and chance for ages. There's biases that come to your brain every single time you read each of these. And you may not realize it when it happens, but when I bring up these scenarios, it actually comes to fore. So it's important for, as you look at these and as your next complication occurs or your partner's complication, you stop the narrative. I think it's really important to stop the narrative and accept it as it is. It is a complication. Once the patient is stabilized and is safe or as good as it's going to get, then we have to stop the narrative and approach with curiosity, not judgment. And so this is what happens when narrative takes over, right? Things just quit making sense. The law of physics just takes a coffee break and we start stopping. Logic goes out the window and it's more drama. So I think it's really important here to stop the narrative, pause, reflect on what's in front of you, and then move on. So I found this, I had this in another talk about reducing mental health stigmas. Well, let's just change it and make it complication stigmas. So here's some practical strategies to reduce complication stigma in the medical profession. Number one, why don't you normalize it and just understand it's going to happen through open dialogue and sharing and talk about it. so that you can talk with your partners, with your fellows, with your residents, or whoever might be on your cath lab teams, and understand that this will happen. The second thing is to create a supportive, psychologically friendly work environment. If you normalize it, you create a culture where you're open and you're still going to love the person no matter what happens, just like your kids, they're going to make mistakes that you really don't want them to do, but they're going to make those mistakes. You have to understand that it's okay to be supportive of them. And last, review systemic practices that may perpetuate complication, stigma, and second victim syndrome. There may be practices in your own cath lab that make this maybe a grilling M&M where nobody wants to go to it because people are not nice and people try to pick out the details, whatever it may be. I think Bill talks about one where people yelled at him when he was a fellow and, not making you feel like you can't even know your own name. And I think it's really important to understand that there may be systemic practices, even in your own places, that you can resist and change. There actually is a program at Johns Hopkins University. I got to throw in some Atlanta Falcons, they're terrible because I hear in Atlanta about Rise Up. There's a program called the RISE, which is a peer-to-peer support for healthcare workers who've been experiencing a stressful patient-related incident or adverse event. That is a program that has a RISE team. That team has trained responders from different disciplines, social workers, nurses, physicians, chaplains, who actually can provide psychological first aid to peers involved in a confidential, non-judgmental environment. I think this is a wonderful step. I would love to see something like this at every single one of our hospitals, and an idea that as each of us has our own complications, we not only have the support of our colleagues, hopefully, who approach with curiosity and not judgment, and our cath lab staff, that we can all work together, but also as a system, and really build a system that each of us can be there for each other as we approach each in daily life, which has the mental challenges beyond compare. I think what we do is very, very unique. I think what we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is very unique, and I'm not taking away from any of our other specialties, but I think it's very important to understand and recognize that, and that each of us will have some of this second victim syndrome, at least at some point in our career. So in summary, complications will happen, period, end of discussion. They're going to have a major impact on each and every single one of us. None of us are robots. AI will not take over our jobs. It can't do stenting yet. But complications can be approached with grace, support, and curiosity. And hopefully, each of us can approach our next complication or our partner's complications or any challenges with those three things: grace, support, and curiosity. Don't jump to conclusions. Stop the narrative. Be the change that is really needed in your cath lab. It starts with you. And let's learn from each other. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for tuning in. I think Dr. Attar is going to join us. Stop sharing here.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. That was excellent. It's going to be quite the challenge to follow that excellent presentation. And there's a fair amount of overlap, which is good. I mean, this is a topic that requires some reinforcement, I think. So that's great. Let me see. I think you can see my screen here. All right. All right. So I was assigned the topic of what are the benefits of sharing your thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so I think this is an important topic, of course, and like I said, there's a bit of overlap with Dr. Klein's talk that he just presented. My disclosure side's a little different. I was assigned this topic of the benefit of sharing my thoughts and emotions with others. And when I received the assignment, I shared it with the mother of my 3 children, who spontaneously burst out into the most raucous laughter that I've heard in quite some time. She was incredulous, in fact, and she shared immediately that you are the last person that should be speaking about this. And to be honest and full disclosure, that brought about some emotions that I'll try to share with you later. But this is what I've been assigned, so here we go. Thank you for the introduction about Dr. Wu's important work coming out of Johns Hopkins. I included a separate anecdote that was from his original article that I want to share with you as a prelude to what I'm going to talk about. And again, like you said, this is a quarter century ago, and that's important to note. He began by recalling an experience from his days in training. So I'm going to read this. When I was a house officer, another resident failed to identify the electrocardiographic signs of the pericardial tamponade that would rush the patient to the operating room late at night. The news spread rapidly. The case tried repeatedly before an incredulous jury of peers, who returned a summary judgment of incompetence. I was dismayed by the lack of sympathy and wondered secretly if I could have made the same mistake, and like the hapless resident, became the second victim of error. Now, a quarter of a century later, the point here is fairly obvious, as was illustrated by Dr. Klein. Although the patient suffers the most, there are others who suffer, including the patient's family members, as well as members of the healthcare team. Certainly, a lot has been published about the effects of procedural complications on operators and healthcare team members over the past 35 years. So again, although my assigned topic is focused on the benefits, we also routinely counsel the patients on the risks of therapy. And just to reinforce, it's important to understand the perceived risks that act as barriers to seeking support or sharing what we are feeling or experiencing as operators that are part of a procedural complication. There was a 56-question survey with a focus on physician distress, including after serious adverse events, that was developed at Brigham and Women's and administered to 108 procedural physicians across a few different specialties. And these barriers can lead to operators feeling frozen, unable to let it go. That's another movie reference for you, Dr. Klein. When it comes to sharing their emotions, right? So some feel that they're so burdened with their care, with the demands of their care, they don't have any time to process from one case to the other, or to heal. There's a lack of confidentiality, and there is a concern that this is going to have a negative impact on the career. And you've already expanded on the stigma. So there's a lot of barriers, and these would be associated as, or interpreted as, risks to prevent somebody from sharing what they're feeling. And it's well established now that in the absence of mechanisms for healing, physicians can find harmful ways to cope with anger, outbursts in the cath lab, or the next day in clinic, projection of blame, right? In my 11-year career, one of the most alarming encounters I've had with another interventionalist was when they flatly told me that when a patient suffers a complication, they don't feel bad, they don't feel responsible. And I was alarmed by that. But what I observed from them in reality was something very different, right? They had defensive postures, anger, throwing the entire team under the bus, throwing the trainees under the bus. That doesn't look like somebody who doesn't care. And so a modicum of compassion goes a long way. But what is it about us that prevents us from sharing our true emotions? So we have to think about all of these things. It may have been the case that past experiences had led to a chilling effect on one's ability to navigate the trauma of a complication. And so we have to have a network that is supportive enough and a safe place for us to heal. On another note, I sit on the VA's National Major Adverse Event Committee, along with Dr. Atkinson, who's one of our panelists, and is chaired by Dr. Zimmett out of San Francisco. So whenever there's a major complication at a VA cath lab across the entire VA network, which is one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States, this includes perforations, strokes, fatalities. There are some automatic reviews and some that are ad hoc. Two of us on this committee review the films and the medical record, and at least one of us reaches out and speaks to the operator. And in my 8 years of serving on this really important committee, I've learned a lot about how operators deal with these complications emotionally, right? So it's part of the peer review or quality process. And so many of us are deathly afraid. We're frozen, we're defensive. I've seen people paralyzed by fear of retaliation, and I've seen blatantly fraudulent documentation. And so what drives us to these behaviors? The VA system for cath lab complication peer review is actually a wonderful tool for operator to speak with external experienced operators as part of their debrief and processing of the complication. They typically express deep gratitude for just listening to their perspective And the process is not designed to be punitive. It's centered around collaboration and with a focus on quality improvement. I think it's clear that learning to cope with complications at an individual level with support throughout your institution is really for everyone's benefit, especially to optimize transparency during the peer review process. It's important because often these processes are really the voice that the patient or the first victim has, right, after the fact. So it's quite important that we focus on that. So what do we stand to gain by sharing our thoughts and emotions, right? I want to share another anecdote. Dr. Lombardi's complications course is annually, one of the best courses in the country, and I attended for the first time this past August, and it was an exceptional course. But I want to share an anecdote from it. One that was so touching, I actually had a hard time hearing about it, right? So in one of these sessions, and I'm not going to name who, but a very experienced senior operator talked about how he dealt with the emotional burden of a recent, very difficult complication, how it affected himself and the family. And it was a beautiful anecdote. But then he shared something very much unexpected to the audience. He shared a picture of his father. He then shared with us a very heavy moment that his father had passed away that very morning of the presentation. And there were audible gasps throughout the entire conference room. It was really something that was a shock to a lot of us. And there were a lot of tears that were shed. I myself lost my father 6 years ago, and I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I decided to step out of the conference room and let the tears fall because I knew it would be a distraction to the audience. So in retrospect, what was accomplished by this speaker sharing his grief and vulnerability with an entire audience of experienced interventionalists and trainees alike? What was accomplished with that? Really, it was a master class on how to gain empathy. Every single person in that room instantly felt for the speaker and their loss and was moved by them. And I imagine that his actions showed all of us what bravery and courage look like in the face of trauma and loss and grief. And we're all better off for it because of what he did. So, as an operator who is part of a serious complication, what do we stand to gain by sharing our thoughts and feelings? Remember, we are part of the healthcare team. We're not the entire team. We're part of it. And it's crucial to process these emotions as a team. So when we share what we're feeling and what we're thinking, first and foremost, we're supported and we support each other. People see us as humans and not just emotionless technicians or robots, right? We have feelings. We're human beings. We're grieving and suffering too. Our teammates then feel safe to open us to communicate. And that way we can process this together. And it's really important that as a cath lab director, for example, when we have these debriefs, some of the most impactful and meaningful conversations that I've had after a complication are with my entire team. Because what happens? I'm able to connect with my team members in a way that strengthens the relationships I have with the people that I depend on to do my work, right? And it makes them feel empowered and unlocks different levels of empathy that wouldn't have otherwise happened. And I think that's the cornerstone, the main benefit of sharing our thoughts and emotions, right? Is gaining that empathy. And I think that is not only important in your healthcare system for your team members, your colleagues who are doing peer review, your patients, et cetera. So, we talk about helping me, helping you, right? It's not only a great line from Jerry Maguire, but it's true. We need to dwell on how we can effectively role model how to deal with the psychological aftermath of a serious complication for our colleagues, our staff, and our trainees. And again, this is why a debrief is a really important role, an integral part of the cath lab after complication, and especially something as traumatic as a cath lab death. As an attending and primary operator, everyone thinks of you as the captain of the team, and everyone's affected by whatever just happened, right? And again, so showcasing your compassion and your vulnerability, your genuine concern, not only for the patient, but for the whole team, unlocks that empathy across the board. And so I think that's an important step to take. And at the end of the day, after I've had this conversation debrief with my colleagues, I know that I'm going home that day. I'm not alone, right? I still feel terrible about what might have happened, but that helps with healing, and it helps with understanding that, what, I wasn't alone that day. I had a whole team and we're there rallying around each other. And I'm in a better situation to handle this long-term aftermath that will invariably affect us, right? And so, after a complication, how do you deal with your emotions with respect to sharing that with families? So another anecdote I'll share. Early in my career, this is after 2 years of me being in private practice, but my first year as an academic attending in my current group, I was referred an inpatient with chest pain in a normal troponin and normal EKG by a senior colleague. And this patient happened to have a calcified mid-LAD stenosis. So I said, okay, I think it's reasonable to treat this mid-LAD. Angioplasty didn't appropriately reduce the stenosis. I didn't want to perform orbital atherectomy after the angioplasty with high pressure non-compliant balloons. So we didn't have IVL at this stage in my career, and I ended up deciding to abort the procedure, admitting the patient, putting him on heparin, and then having him come back for stage atherectomy. There was normal flow, and but the patient continued to have chest pain despite normal telemetry and normal coronary flow. And that should have alerted me to other possibilities, right? Other conditions that maybe I should get a CTA, maybe this patient's having something else happen. I trusted and accepted the judgment of my senior colleague, which wasn't wrong. And ultimately, a couple hours later, after I checked on the patient, went home, I got a call from my first year fellow, hey, the patient's coding. I rushed back and, we couldn't save this patient. He ended up passing away. I suspected the patient had something like maybe an acute or an aortic dissection, and I requested to meet with the family both that evening. There was a limited amount of family available. So both at the time of the complication as well as the next day. So a large group of family members come the next day. Initially, I'm calm and collected while describing the event and offering support to them as well as support of an autopsy. I clearly was grieving along with them, right? They see that too. I see that they're, grieving from their loss, and that provokes a profound emotional response in me. And they see that. And they ultimately understood that I genuinely tried to do the best I could for their family member. And, they declined my offer of an autopsy. I had wished at the time in retrospect that they accepted it because I was unclear about what happened. But what's important for them was that they needed to know the person who did the procedure did it with the best of intentions and genuinely cared about their loved one and was affected by what happened. And that's what they took away from their debrief. And that's what helped them move on. And that's what helped them bring closure. So it's not just about ourselves and how we heal. We have to be mindful of all the different lives that are affected. In my preparation for this talk, I came across a wonderfully constructed and thoughtful review, which is down here, which I'll leave at the end. And it's a thoughtful review of the psychological aspects of procedural complications, including from the perspective of pediatric surgeons. If you can imagine the trauma of having a catastrophic or fatal complication in a pediatric patient. And I'd recommend anybody who's interested in learning more about this subject to kind of spend some time reading this overview. But I wanted to share a few highlights from what I've learned. It reviews the biological and short and long-term psychological responses that occur, a lot of which Dr. Klein already went over, and as well as the factors that impact the severity of the response. And one of those is the level of experience of the operator, right? Importantly, only a third of operators reported that their ability to cope with complications improved as they advanced in their careers with more operating experience. And another really important point I want to spend some time stressing is that early career operators, women, minorities, and trainees are really often marginalized in our healthcare systems, especially when it comes to coping with complications and trauma from adverse events, right? And so that can lead them to being really vulnerable and in terms of having impaired emotional recovery. So just as Dr. Klein shared that example, I want to tell you that my initial reaction to that 35-year-old female interventionalist who's running into trouble is, does she have the support she needs? Does she have the help that she needs, right? That's what we should be thinking of. And it's really important to be sensitive to this as colleagues or leaders in our centers. They proposed a coping model by which individual operators and institutions can work to improve the well-being of operators and manage the reactions to stress of a complication by these 6 factors, right? And so, again, we all improve with understanding experience, trying to be unbiased with what happened, understanding that there are ethics that guide what the transparency should be. But then from an institutional standpoint, you got to have that supportive network. The first and last time I had a perforation, and this is about maybe 5 years ago, Dr. Trong and Dr. Obadiah, both of which were on this call, they showed up to help out, and I felt very much supported. And the peer review process was one that was not punitive but helpful. And so I'm so fortunate to be at an institution that has supportive partners that really care about me, and they know I care about them. And that's what we need to do. We need to raise awareness and amplify the sensitivity to marginalized groups and remove these barriers. Secondly, we have to understand that the first and second victims are always linked, right? So we have to care about the patient and their family, and we have to understand how to be successful in improving their outcomes. And if the patient's passed away, how do we support their family? And that ultimately has been proven to help the second victim deal with the complication as well. And then as a society, we have to prioritize the emotional and spiritual well-being over just the physical aspects of the complication itself. So with that, I'll end, and I really appreciate the opportunity to seg from Dr. Klein's talk to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Attar. I'm going to transition over to Dr. Lombardi, who will just be known as Bill, because he always stops everybody and says, just call me Bill. And for everyone, please just call me Drew. Bill, I'm going to let you share your screens, and we'll get started. Then we'll take some questions here at the end. That was a wonderful talk, and look forward to Bill's presentation on this. And we got some questions in the chat. If any of the panelists would like to respond as well, feel free to jump on board with that. And Bill, turn it over to you.
I was going to say, my slides up? I can't tell.
I can't see it right now, buddy.
All right, let me back up here. I got to get share. There we go. There we go. That's not what I wanted. I'm sharing my Zoom. That seems like the wrong thing. Let's try this again. Share. All right. All right. Is that working now?
You got it.
All right.
Gotta go back to
All right.
There we go.
So I'm supposed to develop a toolkit. So yeah, the one thing why I'll say Bill instead of doctor is because it's a hierarchy thing. And if we're all going to be the same and we're all going to have the same stuff, then you use your first name. And it's not derogatory. It's not that you don't deserve the work that you did to get there. But, when you're a SEAL, the first thing the SEALs learn is nobody has a rank. And the reason is because it opens dialogue and opens communication. So, and since my dad was a pilot, I always put the Blue Angels up because they're a high opportunity system. So tonight, I'm not an interventional cardiologist. I get to be an interventional psychiatrist. And we're entering a restricted area. My disclosure is I've probably had more coronary perforations than any operator on earth. And I've probably had more stable elective deaths than any operator on earth. And it sucks. And what hopefully I can do from the same as I teach from the experience of what I've done, maybe I can teach a little bit from some of the mistakes I've had in handling this stuff. A lot of this has already been discussed by Drew and Ahmed, and I think they've done a great job. I think this is a culture shift that we're working on. So I want to actually move back a little bit to is why are we so punitive? Because if you really want to fix the problem, again, we tend in medicine to treat a lot of symptoms rather than curing the disease. So the symptom is we get traumatized, we get burned out, we feel bad, and we're struggling. But what's the disease? Well, the disease is competition. It's how we're trained. When you go to med school or when you go to undergrad, what do you have to do? You have to be the best. So you have to compete. And when you compete, it's to be the best. When you go to med school, what do? You compete because you got to be the best. When you go to residency, got to be best so I can get the best fellowship. When I go to my fellowship, I got to be the best so I can get the best job. When you get the best job, what's success? As an interventionalist, you're told it's volume, money, and ego. And ego can be your own hospital. It can be your town. It can be your state. It can be the country. It can be the world. It's still just ego. And realize in a world where the pie is only so big and you're competing, the only way to get pieces of that pie is to put others down. We crush those around us to prevent them from getting into our volume. And that's how we're programmed. That's why Eminem is so evil. I want to beat on the young person because I don't want them to threaten me. I don't want to have to learn something new because I'm afraid to show that I didn't know in the first place, and I may not be as good at them. So I'm not going to do it. And the challenge you have in this is none of you know how to be a leader. You know management. Management is I tell you what to do and you do what I say. Leadership is I show you unconditional love because I want you to be greater than me and you'll get better. And physicians, for the most part, are not very good mentors because if you think of the academic world, how many mentors actually want to see their trainees outshine them versus how many use them to get a bunch of papers written and help promote them rather than truly unconditionally trying to see them succeed. So in this, when you step back, one, I want you to think about how is your competitive nature affecting your emotional response? And the second piece that comes with that is how much of your self-worth is from external validation rather than internal validation. So that's me as I'm going through my metamorphosis. That's the old, fat, broken down, drunk, bad person. That's my son on the same trip to remind me that there are better things and things that I value a lot more now than my job and my ego. And I've shown this slide a lot. I'll show it again. And it's the hard thing for everybody here to think about. Green is actually how good you are. The 35-year-old, the 57-year-old, and the 67-year-old, on the green line, they actually exist. Now, where that actually is, who the heck knows? But they're on that green line. That's actually how good you are. But realize those at the bottom have the greatest discrepancy between their self-perceived ability and their actual ability. You actually have to get to the top 10% before it flips. So what this means is you don't even know enough that you don't know what you don't know. And so instead of being vulnerable and saying, I don't know, I need to learn, who do I learn it from? What we tend to do is pretend that we know. How many of you have lied to an attending or a partner? Oh, this is what's going on when you have no idea. Because you're much more afraid to admit you have no idea than to be honest about it. Because it's grilled out of us. Don't say you don't know because you'll get in trouble. People will make fun of you, right? The number one reason people don't do imaging is because they can't read it. Nobody says that because nobody has the courage to just admit is, I actually don't know how to read it. Well, you can learn, but to learn, you have to admit, I don't know. Most people can't learn they don't know. So where are you? Right? And the real question that is, you can't answer that honestly because your self-perceived reflection of you is clearly wrong. So the real question is, who do you trust to tell you? And would you believe them? If I sat and walked in your lab and said, hey, gosh, I'm really sorry, but you probably need to work on your bifurcation technique. And here are some things I would think about. And these are the ways we do purposeful practice. Are you going to be like, oh, he's an asshole. He doesn't care about me. He's just trying to show how great he is and put me down. Or would you accept it with, gosh, he really cares and wants me to be better? Most people, right, would take it as I'm mean, right? What I would love to do if I had the money and time, I would love to be able to just walk into cath labs and coach people every day because I'm pretty good at my job and I've done a lot and I've got a lot of experience. But do you know that 90% of interventionalists would not want me in the room because it would threaten them? How sad is that we're so competitive that makes us feel threatened rather than embraced, loved, and cared for. So these are my coaches. On the left is Aaron Grantham from Mid-America Heart Institute. He doesn't look quite normal because he's a little bit drunk and he just caught that fish off the back of my boat. The ungainly guy in the middle is me as I'm falling apart. And the other is my son, who's my youngest son, who's on the spectrum, who's gone through a lot of issues growing up and has made me a much, much better person than I ever would have been because he taught me about how to have grace and compassion and stop judging based on my view of the world, but allow him to be judged on his view of the world. And I can report he's now a sophomore at the University of Montana studying geology. And I'm thrilled because I never thought he'd get out of high school. So I've been blessed that he, despite my challenges, has really shown up and shine. That's my two sons and my wife. And these remind me what really matter when things go wrong. If you have a bad day in the lab and you're struggling, do you go home and kick the dog, which is your family and your partner? Or can you sit down and just cry? Can you tell them I'm hurting? Can you tell them I'm hurting in a way that gets them to hug you rather than run away from you? That became my issue with my wife. When I wanted a hug and I needed help, I wouldn't get it fast enough, and that would make me angry. And the moment I got angry, she ran away, which just made me more angry, and it started a vicious cycle that went on for a decade. So here's the issues for us to work on. Are you being listened to? So at the same complications course that Ahmed brought up, Aaron Grantham got up. A good friend of ours in Minnesota had a horrible complication and a patient died. And Aaron heard through the grapevine about it. And Aaron, like most people, is like, I'm not going to talk to him. I'm going to leave him alone. He's kind of scared. And we've been working a lot together on something. He goes, actually, I'm going to call him. So he called him up and said, hey, I heard you had this really bad thing happen. Are you okay? And the other person's response was, no, I'm really struggling. And his second thing was, I've been in this job 20 years. That's the first time anybody's ever asked after a complication if I'm okay. So if you take nothing away from everybody's talks tonight is, can you just show up for people differently by saying, are you okay? Right? Today was a great example. I that 57-year-old air embolus, that's me. And I'm meeting with a lawyer about it on Thursday because the family's angry about it. And we also reviewed today at M&M another case that I was involved in that didn't survive. And I told everybody at the end, I was like, I'm really traumatized right now. I've got to do a live case. It's super hard. It's super high risk. I'm not sure I'm going to be okay today. And 3 of my partners came up after M&M and gave me a hug and just said, we love you. You're a good man. We're here for you. We got your back. That's a good environment. We've helped build that, but you've got to build that for yourself. The second thing comes up is, are you a different person at work than home? And if so, why? Right? An authentic person is an authentic person. If you can't be yourself at work, then we have to work on your environment at work, and we have to work about your vulnerability, and we have to work about the vulnerability and communication of those around you. Right? Because we should be able to be the same person. It's too hard to remember 2 different lives. It's a lot of work. Right? It gets very confusing to remember who's saying what to whom and how you do that. And then the last piece is, who do you really need to be accountable to? Right? I bring this up for people. If you're spiritual, you're not an atheist, and you believe in a higher being, do you think that higher being would ever talk to you about you the way that you talk to yourself about you? And the answer for the most part is no. So first of all, why are you holding yourself to a higher standard than you hold others? And why are you so critical of yourself compared to others? And why do you put others down to make yourself feel good? Why don't we just all accept that we're imperfect, right? As Andrew brought up, how many of us have never had a complication? 0. And if you haven't, just means you read echoes and you don't do cases. And the second is, even the people who read echoes, they actually harm more people than you do in the cath lab, because acts of omission, which are all about risk aversion, actually harm far more patients in the United States than acts of commission. Acts of commission are just easier to track and easier to know what's going on. So we can do better. I like to fish. It's a buddy of mine's son looking up at the fish I just caught. So what are some of the things you can do to change, not just to allow yourself the ability to feel healthier, more vulnerable, and less traumatized, but those around you? So number 1, realize The only thing you really control in any discussion is your response, right? My internal values, when I started teaching CTOs, all I wanted to do was see doctors do a better job, mostly because I knew patients were getting harmed because they weren't getting treated. But if you met me 10 years ago or 5 years ago, you'd be like, he's a super critical, pretentious asshole who just judges everybody and critiques everybody, and he's just mean. Now you'd say, gosh, Bill's really thoughtful. He's compassionate. He's got grace. He's comparing. Same internal values. But my response and my communication and my behavior, totally different. So when you watch a behavior that harms you, bullies you, traumatizes you, be careful that you're not passing that on. So think about, how would I like to be treated before you open your mouth and unload on somebody? The other is build horizontal communication. As we talked about, Ahmed brought this up, right? Talk to your team. Everybody in the room is as equally damaged as you are. Actually, I will tell you, you know who the most traumatized person in the room is? The nurse. Because they're the last person who saw the patient and their family alive and unharmed. Now, the hard part is you have to show great EQ of, I'm really sorry. This happened today. My tech twice gave me the wrong balloon. And I just looked at it and we had a live case about to come up, but it slowed me down. I got a little frustrated. I'm just like, that's me. That's my fault. My bad communication. I am not being clear about what we need and where we need to do. I'm sorry. You're doing great. Let's figure this out. This is what I need. Right. But in the moment, I can't blast them and say, you suck. You slow me down. Jesus Christ, I asked for this. What's wrong with you? I have to make sure I take ownership of that and make them feel safe. The second is, I'll tell you, you're all never going to get good at anything if your culture doesn't allow complications and doesn't allow failure to occur. And the reason is you'll have risk aversion. And what risk aversion leads to is a culture that suppresses. And the reason it suppresses is unproductive failure. You cannot learn something that you never try. And the way I highlight this is, have you ever been at a meeting and someone on the panel, some very well-known famous person on the panel says, that will never be widely adopted? What that person is saying is, I am afraid to learn it, and I sure as hell don't want you to learn it, because then that makes me look bad. And so I want everybody in the room to have unproductive failure, because I don't want to look bad, because I don't want to learn it, because I don't have an environment that lets me fail, right? What I've done in CTOs, there's nothing special. It's just hard work, learning, changing mindset, changing approach. What Jamie McCabe does in our lab, I'm sorry, Jamie does not have magic fingers and a magic brain. He's got great mental capacity, great grit, great willingness to fail, and great opportunity to keep learning. That's what you're looking for. And you have to build that environment. They don't just happen. That is me about 2 weeks before my life functionally ends with my 2 kids and a big fish. I've changed a little bit. If you notice, I look a little different. So do you want to get better? 1, radical acceptance. What does that mean? When you're angry, you're frustrated, you're cowering, you're about to say something you shouldn't, ask yourself, why am I that way? Is the current emotional state going to help? Is what I'm about to say going to fix the problem? If the answer is, it's not helping, I can't fix the problem, and I really don't want to spend the time and effort to fix it in the first place, then let it go. Don't let other people take your joy. So as Ahmed brought up, be curious, not judgmental. Number 1 person to be curious with, start with you. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I defensive? Why am I angry? When somebody points the finger at you and starts beating you up in M&M, why don't you look at them and say, how is this helping me? I already feel awful that this person got injured. I'm already traumatized. This is not helping that. I am not learning. The second piece goes back to build intrinsic worthiness, right? I've talked about this a lot. My therapy started with, I am a good and worthy man. You're a woman, I'm a good and worthy woman. Actually, it's my mantra, make up your own damn mantra. But I had to say that, I still say it. And for a year, I didn't believe it because I was worthless. I can tell you what worthlessness feels like. I lived it. And what happened is, as I built my internal worthiness, great case did not give me a high. But also when a bad case or complication is, a bad thing happened. That does not make me bad. Too many people in our profession, when a complication occurs, I'm bad. I did bad. I'm horrible. I should suffer. No, you shouldn't. You're a good person. You're doing your best. You want to be able to learn from it. That does not make you bad. So you have to separate your worthiness from the event, which then gives you the emotional stability to critique the event, not from good and bad, but from what can I really learn to get better? And the last thing in this is vulnerability, to be able to say, I don't know, to say other people do know, we need to learn, isn't a weakness. That's how you get better. I can tell you, in my world, I'll look to anybody to get better. And if you can defend why it's better and I do it and it makes me better, then I'll keep going. If you can't defend it or I can't figure it out, then it's just BS and I'll ignore it. But I'm never going to critique you unless I've been there. Here's some things about narratives. We talked about having a narrative and bringing it to the table. So you can read this. And then when you get done, read them the other direction. Instead of reading them Western, read them Eastern. It's amazing what happens when you say confidence kills doubt. Peace kills jealousy. Growth kills ego. Dreams kill fear. Think about what you say to yourself manifests your outcome. There are a bunch of books that I've been through. They're all for sort of different things. Andrew brought up Daring Greatly, which is about shame and vulnerability. If you want, the talks live, you can get this book list. We can talk about what each one's about. But these are things that I read. When you read them, I'm going to give you some advice. One, read them with an open mind. Be vulnerable that what you've been isn't what's going to get you where you need to go. Two, read them like a textbook. Take notes, thumb pages, highlight, remember. Three, when you're done, pick 1 to 3 action items to purposely practice to change. Things that you're going to try to do differently and fail at to get better. Sometimes these forums are really tough for people to be open with a big group. Plus, I know this is also being shared online and being streamed. So I'll bring up one. I do a podcast that covers a lot of these topics. Actually, Andrew was on discussing suicide with physicians, and that was a really important topic to me because I have considered suicide, and I know others out there have thought about harming themselves, and I think it's a really important topic for us to discuss. Those are my 2 emails. One's from work, one's from personal. Yes, it's a stupid name, but it's my nickname and deal with it. There's my cell phone. And as Ahmed brought up, the complications course, this year it's 3 days. July 10th, which is a Thursday, will be all structural complications. The middle day will be the psychology and legal issues in regards to complication and building cultures, as well as sort of some crossover of access and hemodynamics and other things. And then the coronary day will be on Saturday. Registration will probably open sometimes in February or March. My guess is it's going to sell out this year. So if you see it, blow block out the time, we'd love to have you. And again, Andrew and Ahmed and everyone on the call, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I hope you find it useful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to panelists and let anyone who, there's one question in the chat I just want to bring up that one of our trainees brought up about speaking about, could you comment on how/when mindset from grieving and processing to thinking critically about lessons learned and what to do differently next time? When do you think, I'm going to turn it over to maybe Allison or any of our panelists here to discuss that, about how do you switch? When does that happen, or how do you do that? Because I think there is a grieving reaction and we all have our individual timelines to do that. And that may be, that's all dependent on your interpersonal and kind of what you go. But let me turn it over to the panel and answer. I know we're running a little bit behind, so thank you everyone for sticking with us and ask for any comments on that.
Yeah, I'll comment on that, Drew. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think it's a great question. And thank you to the speakers. I got a lot out of this. I hope everybody that was listening did, and great job. So to answer that question, I think it really depends on the person and on the case. I'll tell you, for me, when something really bad happens, I don't sleep for 2 weeks. I mean, I literally probably get an hour or two of sleep a night. I know that I'm going to be exhausted for a couple weeks, and that's kind of my way of grieving. I need the time to talk to my family, talk to my partners, and go through the grieving process before I really can actually sit down and look at the case and say, what could have changed? I think a mistake I've made in the past is trying to, come out of the case, sit down and review it with somebody and try to figure out, well, what the hell happened? What went wrong? And you don't really learn from that. You just kind of beat yourself up when you do that. And so I've made it a rule really to not try to learn anything from it until I feel like I've gotten through the grieving process. And I think that's probably different for different physicians, but that's my way of handling it.
Dr. Abadaya?
Well, I can't agree more with Allison. I can tell you that a colleague of mine, who's actually a member of the panel here, Dr. Trong, likes to say very often, sorry, Tam, I'm going to paraphrase you, is that after an event, it's very lonely to be there after an issue. So I can say that we work quite closely together and fairly often. And on the occasional unfortunate event that occurs, it's a godsend to have someone like him be there. He's probably the only colleague I've had in recent years that actually stayed in the lab or gone with me to the OR to follow the patient. We do that. The one piece that I found especially helpful, and this I learned really early on, it was given advice towards it, is that it's very valuable if you're early on in your career, but it can occur at any level of your career, is to identify a confidant. Maybe it could be a senior mentor, it could be a colleague close to you in the cath lab, somebody you can talk to. Identify that person up front in your workplace, build a rapport with them, work with them, and then when an event occurs, I was going to say if an event occurs, but let's be honest, it's going to occur, then obtaining the support and the validation, having that conversation with them at some point, and having that support is invaluable. Do this early, do this after the event. Once, of course, as Allison has mentioned, you're able to actually cope with it, and focus on gaining insight from the event as opposed to beating yourself up, beating someone else up, or trying to shift blame. And having an outside person, a trusted outside person, give you that standing, give you that foundation is extremely helpful.
Dr. Trong?
I think Dr. Athar has his hand up.
Oh, it's okay, Dr. Trong, if you've got something to mention, go ahead.
Yeah, I wrote something, but also I think it's important to give good feedbacks too. When you're in clinic and your colleagues done some great work, to make sure you send positive feedback. It's just like I was trying to teach my little daughter piano last night. she played like 99 notes correct and one note was wrong. She was very upset. And we keep you know, perseverating on one of these events where, you know, all these other patients we were able to help. So we need to be supportive of each other in those scenarios as well.
I just wanted to add, I know it's running late. Eunice, this is a really terrific question that you posed, and I agree with what everyone said. I mean, I don't think there's a switch that gets flipped. It's hard to separate, you know, your grieving process and your responsibility about learning from the complication. But I also want to just spend a second talking about part of the process of, you know, managing the complication, or, you know, the aftermath of it, is documenting. Right. And oftentimes our thought processes are disturbed to some degree. And so while it's really important after a complication to document more, not less, right? So you want to document for the purposes of transparency for the patient, you know, on their behalf, as well as so the family can come back to that. But sometimes what you're thinking may change, or you may be more clear the next day or subsequent day. So it's not wrong to add an addendum, you know, if you're so unraveled by the emotions of what happened, it's essential to make sure you document appropriately in a transparent fashion. That's something that I've learned in my time on this committee, that, you know, that really separates those who respond in a mature fashion to a complication versus those who, you know, just kind of shut things down and don't talk. That's actually not helpful. So I would suggest, you know, again, if you need to come back to the documentation after you've had time to process and cope, that's not a wrong thing to do.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Anyone else on the panel have any final comments? I know we've run over a fair amount, but again, I think this is a valuable topic and underscores the importance of how to handle complications, because they will occur, and how to handle the fallout from it. I think we heard a great summaries on from second victim syndrome and from each of the speakers, but also from the panelists. And thank you for all the questions. Anyone else want to make any final comments?
No, I'll say, Drew, for the webinar next month, we'll kind of elaborate a little bit on some of these things, second victim syndrome, and you know, dealing emotionally with not necessarily complications, but the stress of our jobs. So stay tuned for that. So if anybody would like to join for that, we'd love to have you there.
Great.
And
Thanks
thank you again to all the speakers. Fabulous job.
Thanks
Awesome.
everyone for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for the opportunity of joining us. Thank you to the panelists and to amazing speakers, Allison, for arranging this task force and leading it. Thank you to SCAI, Alan, for everyone setting this up and for the opportunity. We look forward to the next webinar. Thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.